Rome had always believed it could not be broken. For centuries, its armies had marched, conquered, and returned victorious. Enemies feared the Roman legions as an unstoppable machine of discipline and steel. But in the summer of 216 BC, all that confidence began to crack. It started with one man, Hannibal Barca of Carthage. He was no ordinary general. From the time he was a boy, he had been raised with one purpose: destroy Rome. He carried not just skill, but a burning hatred, and he would dedicate his life to breaking the Republic's pride. In the years before Cannae, Hannibal had already shocked the world. With an army of Africans, Spaniards and war elephants, he had crossed the Alps, a feat thought impossible. Snow, hunger, and avalanches killed thousands, yet he emerged into Italy like a phantom from the mountains. Rome expected him to fail. Instead, he destroyed Roman armies at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene. The mighty Republic was humiliated again and again. By 216 BC, Rome had had enough. The Senate swore it would end this nightmare once and for all. They gathered the largest army the Republic had ever seen, over 80,000 men, more than double Hannibal's numbers. Consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus promised the people a final, crushing victory. Rome believed the war would end in glory. But Hannibal was not afraid. He understood something the Romans did not: size meant nothing if the enemy could not breathe. He studied their arrogance, their hunger for a decisive clash. He knew they would not hold back. They would march straight at him, convinced sheer power would overwhelm his smaller army. And that was exactly what he wanted. Cannae, a dusty plain in southern Italy, was chosen for the battle. The land was wide and flat, perfect for Rome's massive army to deploy. To them, it looked like an arena built for victory. To Hannibal, it was the stage for a masterpiece of destruction. The night before the battle, Rome celebrated, convinced of its triumph. Hannibal's camp was quieter, filled with men from many lands who trusted only in their commander's genius. He walked among them, calm and watchful, preparing not just for a fight, but for the greatest gamble of his life. At dawn, the legions would march forward, banners high, believing they were unstoppable. But hidden within Hannibal's plan was a trap no army had ever seen before. Rome was about to learn that even the strongest empire can bleed. And in a single day, they would face a nightmare so brutal it would be remembered for more than 2,000 years. The sun rose over the dusty fields of Cannae. Heat waves shimmered across the plain, and the Roman legions stood in formation, row after row of shields and spears stretching as far as the eye could see. 80,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever assembled, ready to crush their enemy in one overwhelming strike. The Senate had demanded victory. Citizens had been promised revenge. The generals believed that Hannibal would finally be buried under sheer numbers. Confidence filled the Roman camp, but it was the confidence of arrogance, a belief that numbers alone made them invincible. On the other side, Hannibal's army waited. His forces were smaller, a mix of Africans, Iberians, Gauls and cavalry. They spoke different tongues, carried different weapons, but they were united by one thing: trust in Hannibal. He had led them across mountains, through rivers, into victories no one thought possible. Now, facing the largest army in the world, he was calm. The ground itself would become his weapon. The open plain allowed Rome to spread wide, but Hannibal wanted the opposite. He wanted their strength packed into a tight space, where they could not maneuver, where their numbers became a curse. He arranged his army in a way no one expected. At the center, he placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and Iberians, men who had fought hard but were exhausted. Behind them, on both flanks, he placed his most disciplined African infantry, armed with long spears and shields. And on the wings, he placed his cavalry, the deadly Numidians on one side, and the heavy cavalry on the other. It looked like a strange choice. The Romans stared at the center of Hannibal's line and saw weakness. They saw a soft spot waiting to be crushed. And that was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to believe. The Roman generals argued over tactics. Lucius Aemilius Paulus wanted caution, aware of Hannibal's cunning. But Gaius Terentius Varro, eager for glory, insisted on an all-out attack. He believed that with so many legions, nothing could go wrong. In the end, Varro's voice carried the day. The order was given: march forward, smash the enemy's center, end the war. The trap was set. As the Romans advanced, their formation tightened. Soldiers pressed forward in a massive column, eager to crush the Carthaginian center. Dust filled the air, drums thundered, and tens of thousands of feet shook the earth. From the outside, it looked unstoppable, a wall of iron moving straight into Hannibal's line. But to Hannibal, it looked exactly as he had planned. His center slowly began to give way, bending backward under the weight of the Roman assault. At first, it appeared the Romans were winning, pushing the Carthaginians back. Shouts of victory rose in the Roman ranks. But every step forward only pulled them deeper into the trap. On the flanks, Hannibal's African infantry held firm, waiting. They stood like stone walls, watching as the Roman column squeezed further and further into the collapsing center. Soon, the massive Roman army was bunched together in a tight mass, pressed so close that men could barely swing their swords. Still, the Romans pushed forward, blind to what was happening around them. They believed the center was breaking. They believed victory was at hand. But Hannibal had given them exactly what they wanted, the illusion of success. Behind the dust and noise, his cavalry began to move. The heavy horsemen charged the Roman cavalry on one wing, smashing them apart. On the other side, the Numidian riders outmaneuvered their opponents with lightning speed. One by one, the Roman cavalry was destroyed or scattered, leaving the massive Roman infantry exposed. Now the jaws of the trap began to close. The morning sun climbed higher, burning down on the plain of Cannae. The dust of 80,000 Roman soldiers rose in a thick cloud as the legions pressed forward. Shields locked, spears thrust, their mass moved like an iron tide. From a distance, it looked unstoppable. At the front, Roman centurions barked orders. Lines tightened. The huge column grew denser with every step, as men in the rear pushed forward, eager to join the fight. The legionaries believed they were moments away from crushing Hannibal's army once and for all. Every soldier carried the promise of Rome's victory, the end of this long nightmare. Hannibal's center faced the pressure first. His Iberian and Gallic troops held their ground, but the Roman advance was fierce. Swords clashed, spears snapped, men screamed as the weight of Rome's largest army slammed into them. Slowly, step by step, Hannibal's center began to bend. The Romans saw it and shouted in triumph. To them, this was proof of weakness. They pressed harder, eager to finish the job. But Hannibal did not panic. He had expected this. In fact, he had designed it. His center continued to retreat in controlled steps, bending back into the shape of a shallow crescent. To the Romans, it looked like collapse. To Hannibal, it was the beginning of perfection. As the legionaries pushed forward, the space around them grew tighter. Packed shoulder to shoulder, men could barely raise their arms. The dust choked their lungs. Heat from the midday sun weighed on their armor. What had begun as an overwhelming advance was turning into suffocation. Meanwhile, on the wings, the African infantry stood waiting. These were Hannibal's strongest soldiers, disciplined and heavily armed. They did not move forward yet. They simply held their positions, watching the Roman mass swell deeper into the trap. The Roman generals believed they were winning. Varro shouted for the legions to push harder, to smash through the center and end the fight. Paulus hesitated, sensing something was wrong, but his warnings were drowned by the roar of thousands pressing forward. The Roman army was now so deep inside the Carthaginian line that retreat was impossible. Behind them, a far more dangerous move was already in motion. Hannibal's cavalry, having shattered the Roman horsemen on both wings, wheeled around. Dust rose as hundreds of riders swept behind the Roman army, cutting off their only escape. The Romans still did not realize the danger. Their focus was on the center, which continued to fall back step by step. The illusion was complete. The legions believed they were seconds away from victory. In truth, they were seconds away from the deadliest trap in Roman history. What came next would not be a battle. It would be slaughter. The trap was ready to close. The Romans, packed into a giant human mass, surged forward with no space to maneuver. Dust blinded their eyes. Sweat poured beneath heavy armor. Men shouted, but their voices drowned in the roar of 80,000 bodies pressing tighter and tighter. What had begun as a confident advance was turning into a prison of flesh and iron. At the edges of this storm, Hannibal gave the signal. His African infantry, disciplined, silent, waiting for the perfect moment, suddenly advanced. With shields locked and spears thrust, they slammed into the exposed Roman flanks. The legionaries, trapped shoulder to shoulder, could not turn to face them. They tried to shift sideways, but there was no space. Blades stabbed into the mass, cutting men down row after row. At that same moment, Hannibal's cavalry completed its sweep. After smashing the Roman horsemen, the riders had circled behind the legions. Now they charged into the Roman rear, sealing the final gap. The army of Rome, the largest it had ever sent to battle, was surrounded. The double envelopment was complete. For the first time in history, an army this size had been swallowed whole. Panic rippled through the Romans. Soldiers in the front screamed for space, but those behind shoved forward. Men in the middle suffocated, unable to breathe, crushed by the press of bodies. Discipline collapsed. The machine-like legions that once terrified the world were now a trapped mob, struggling only to survive. Hannibal's men showed no mercy. The Iberians and Gauls in the center fought like demons, driving the Romans backward into their own comrades. The Africans on the flanks sliced into exposed sides, hacking down line after line. And from the rear, cavalry slashed through those who tried to break free. The killing was relentless. Dust turned to mud as blood soaked the ground. Men slipped on corpses, fell, and were trampled by their own comrades. Legionaries begged the gods for escape, but none came. What had been an army was now a slaughterhouse. The sun climbed higher, merciless in the sky. Hours passed, and still the killing continued. The sound of iron on iron mixed with screams, then slowly with silence, as the trapped Romans were cut down. Entire cohorts disappeared, swallowed by the press and the blades. By evening, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Piles of bodies stretched across the plain. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans lay dead. The ground was littered with broken shields, shattered spears, and the blood of an empire that had believed itself invincible. Only a handful escaped. Among them was a young officer named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would one day return to face Hannibal at Zama. But for now, Rome had suffered its darkest day. For Hannibal, the victory was complete. With fewer than 50,000 men, he had destroyed an army nearly twice his size. His tactics at Cannae were unmatched, a masterpiece of deception, patience, and precision. The Romans had walked into his trap with pride, and he had crushed them with genius. When news reached Rome, shock turned to despair. Families mourned fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. Senators debated whether the Republic itself could survive. Many thought the war was lost, that Hannibal would march on the city and finish Rome forever. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. He remained in the south, gathering allies, waiting for the Republic to collapse from within. It was a decision that puzzled historians for centuries. Why not finish the job? Perhaps he lacked the resources, perhaps he believed Rome would destroy itself. But Rome, even broken and bleeding, refused to die. Still, on that day at Cannae, the Republic faced a nightmare it had never imagined. An army wiped out in a single battle. Generals dead. Senators grieving. The myth of Roman invincibility shattered. It was more than a defeat. It was annihilation. When the slaughter at Cannae ended, silence fell over the plain. The dust settled, the cries of the dying faded, and the smell of blood and death hung heavy in the summer air. Tens of thousands of Roman bodies lay piled together, so tightly packed that survivors later said it was impossible to walk without stepping on the dead. Of the 80,000 who had marched that morning, barely a fraction escaped. Nearly all of Rome's consuls, praetors, and senior officers lay dead among their men. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the consul who had urged caution, fell fighting with dignity. Gaius Terentius Varro, who had insisted on battle, survived but fled in shame. News of the disaster raced across Italy. When it reached Rome, the city was paralyzed with grief. Families waited for their sons, brothers, and fathers who would never return. The Senate met in silence, knowing that nearly 1/5 of Rome's adult male population had been lost in a single day. Panic spread. Some whispered that Rome could not recover, that Hannibal would march on the city and finish what he had begun. Superstitions grew, people sacrificed animals, begged the gods for forgiveness, and feared the end of their republic. But Rome did not collapse. And that was the difference between defeat and destruction. Instead of surrendering, the Senate declared a national emergency. Citizens as young as 17 and as old as 45 were drafted. Slaves were promised freedom if they fought for Rome. Weapons were pulled from temples and ancient storerooms. The city braced itself, expecting Hannibal at its gates any day. Hannibal, however, made a different choice. He did not march on Rome. He believed the Republic was already broken and would collapse without another battle. He waited for Rome's allies in Italy to desert the Republic and join him. Many did, but not enough. Rome, even wounded, held firm. Still, the shadow of Cannae hung over the city. Never before had the Republic suffered such devastation. Historians estimate that between 50 and 70,000 Romans died that day, more men than the United States lost on D-Day, more than Britain lost in the entire Battle of the Somme. Cannae was not just a defeat, it was a national trauma. Yet Rome learned from it. The Republic abandoned the strategy of massive head-on battles. Instead, Roman commanders adopted caution, refusing to meet Hannibal in open combat. They harassed his supply lines, avoided traps, and slowly wore down his strength. Over the years, the tide turned. The name Publius Cornelius Scipio emerged, the young officer who survived Cannae. He studied Hannibal's tactics, learned from Rome's mistakes, and eventually carried the war into North Africa. At Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio faced Hannibal directly. This time, the trapper became the trapped. Hannibal was defeated, and Carthage's power was broken forever. But even in defeat, Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae lived on. Generals for centuries studied it. The German Schlieffen Plan in World War I, the Blitzkrieg of World War II, and countless modern strategies drew inspiration from his double envelopment. Military academies across the world still teach Cannae as the ultimate example of how strategy can annihilate even the strongest army. For Rome, Cannae became a scar and a symbol. It reminded them of their vulnerability, of the price of arrogance, and of the resilience that kept their republic alive. The Romans who survived vowed never to underestimate an enemy again. Cannae was Rome's darkest day. It showed that even the most powerful empire can bleed. But it also revealed Rome's greatest strength, the will to endure. Hannibal had delivered the deadliest defeat in Roman history, yet Rome did not die. Instead, from the ashes of Cannae, it rose stronger, more determined, and ready to one day conquer the world.